It's a real privilege for me to be here, given the nature of the environment and sustainability challenge that we're all familiar with. It's quite clear that without the engagement of the business community, that this is something that is simply going to be impossible to solve. So it's great for me to observe the kind of engagement that CNI Brazilian industry is involved in these sets of challenges. So it's a privilege for me to be here. We've heard from both Minister Teixeira and Prime Minister Brundtland's remarks, the nature of the challenges both at the domestic level and the global level. And here, when we think about the global governance challenge, I'm always reminded by a cartoon, a drawing that I saw some years back about the nature of international conferences. There was this picture of a big UN-type conference with all kinds of delegations and sort of in the conference hall, and everybody's waiting for the meeting to start. And two delegates are talking to each other, and one of them says, "Well, why can't we get going? What are we waiting for?" And the other one says, "Well, we're waiting for the last translator to arrive." And in the back of the room, you can see all these, translation booths that go, English to French, English to Arabic, Portuguese to English, and so forth. They all have translators in them, but the last booth is empty. And the last booth is called Promise into Action. That translator hasn't arrived yet. Well, we have had some successes, as Prime Minister Brundtland mentioned, but the challenges are huge. In the limited time that I have, I just want to make remarks under three headings. One, the global setting. What kind of a global environment are we going into? Second, the corporate challenges. And third, the questions of industrial policy, which I think are critical in this area. First, on the global setting. We are going, I think, into an extremely difficult period where, as difficult as it is to get any kind of global cooperation, global governance going, in the next decade or so, I think this is going to be even more difficult than we have experienced. I think there are two fundamental reasons for this. One is that there is a structural transformation of the world economy. The world economy is moving from a relatively centralized system where a few large countries could set the terms, could agree, and sometimes often actually agree to pay the global public goods, but in any case reach agreement, to one where increasingly, of course, we have a larger number of countries that need to be engaged. These are the emerging markets, but the developing countries more broadly. This is, of course, good because their relative economic power and political power has increased, but that creates a huge structural challenge in terms of reaching decisions for both because the number of key actors has now increased significantly, as well as because some of the most important key actors, in fact, are countries that guard national sovereignty very zealously. So they are not the kinds of countries that are going to easily succumb to international agreement. Certainly, China and India fall into that category. I'm not going to say anything about Brazil in that respect. But there's a fundamental structural problem that I think is going to make international cooperation and agreement much more difficult. The second underlying trend may be even more dangerous, which is that in terms of overall economic growth, we're moving into a very, very bad period. I think even in circumstances, we are going to be in a very low growth kind of an environment. Just yesterday, I published a piece called The End of the World as We Knew It. And I didn't even mention climate change once. It was all about the possible fallouts from the Eurozone crisis. And it's not that difficult to sketch out a scenario where, in fact, the Eurozone crisis, which in all likelihood is going to get worse with a possible dissolution of the euro area, will have significant spillovers in terms of economic effects, not just the United States and Asia and emerging markets, but also significant political effects in terms of reconfiguration of political relations, the rise of extremist forces, and up to even the potential of US-China strategic and military conflict. Now, it was an extreme scenario, but unfortunately, in light of what has been happening in the last few years, it's not an entirely implausible scenario, at least not as implausible as we would like it to be. So what that means is that we are going to be in an economic environment, at best, of very low growth, with structural problems that impede global governance and global coordination. And the action, therefore, will have to take place, mostly at the local, national, and subnational level, and that's where the movement will have to take place. Now, given that complicated situation we're moving into, I think the pattern of economic performance around the world will be even more heterogeneous, more differentiated than we've had. And I think if I ask myself the question, which are the types of economies, the types of countries that are going to be less affected by the relative turmoil, instability, and low growth of the next decade, I come to the conclusion that the relatively successful countries will share three features. One is that they will have relatively sound public finances. That is, that they will have relatively low public debt. So, of course, that rules out most of the industrial world for obvious reasons. The second key feature is that they are going to be relatively less reliant on the world economy, that their domestic home market will play a bigger role than the world market, in the sense that they don't rely on exports to generate their growth to a significant extent, they don't run large trade surpluses, or they don't have a huge need for net capital inflows from abroad. So that's going to rule out countries like Turkey, for example, which actually has a huge current account deficit. And third, these are countries that are robust democracies. They have good mechanisms of domestic decision-making, domestic conflict management that can ride their societies and economies during this period of turmoil. And that's going to rule out countries like China. It's going to rule out countries like Russia. Now, Brazil actually looks quite good in all those three dimensions, in terms of low public debt, in terms of relatively less reliance on the world economy, given it is its large size, and that it is a robust democracy. So I think among all the gloom, if there are one of the few countries that I'm relatively optimistic about is Brazil. But then again, in the context of a relatively negative outlook for the world economy. Now, so the environment for firms, for corporations, is going to be a particularly tough one. And in the context of sustainability, what can they do? There was a nice study a few months back that was put together by the World Economic Forum and the Boston Consulting Group that looked at a large cross-section of firms from emerging markets that they called the new sustainability champions. And the list actually included a couple of Brazilian firms as well. And I think they very usefully summarized what is the key to the success of these new sustainability champions from the emerging markets. One is that they turn disadvantage into advantage. They use innovation in order to turn relative lack of resources or environmental issues and sustainability problems into competitive advantage. And that it fundamentally makes economic sense, and we've heard many of these examples and the argument already in these testimonials earlier, which is that the environmental and sustainability challenge tells us that many of the resources and the inputs that companies are using are going to get scarcer over time. Therefore, their costs are going to rise over time. And therefore, firms can get a competitive advantage by positioning themselves before their rivals, before their competitors, to economizing on those resources and innovating into practices that are environmentally sustainable. So taking a long term, this makes perfect sense from a corporate profitability perspective. But the successful firms go beyond that in two other dimensions. One is that they embed the culture of sustainability throughout the entire company. So it is not just the sustainability officer, it's not just the vice president in charge of sustainability, it's just not the CEO, it's not just the board, but it's the employees and it's their customers. So embedding those values into the operation of the entire company seems to distinguish these companies from others. And that, of course, requires an incentive system, a compensation system, a system of spreading values within the company that goes beyond the very top echelons. And the last element that distinguishes these firms is that they actively shape the environment within which they operate. So they are not passive recipients of the demands of their customers, the requirements of their suppliers, or the regulations that the governments promulgate within which they operate, but they actually shape, they actively participate in shaping that environment, in influencing the way that that suppliers work the land or cut the wood or use irrigation and water. They participate in training of their consumers and other stakeholders. And most importantly, they cooperate with the government in the setting of standards, in certification, in policies with respect to R&D, the entire policy setting which affects so much the cost and benefits of these alternative corporate strategies. And that last point brings me to the final set of thoughts I wanted to share with you on industrial policy. Because when we talk about how firms engage the public sector, they engage in government in shaping their environment, we are fundamentally talking about the domain of industrial policy. And in fact, when you think about green growth, when you think about changing the structure of production to serve not just the economic and social objectives, but also the environmental and sustainable objectives of a society, you cannot avoid the question of the government's industrial policy, how the government is interacting with business in shaping the policy environment that affects business. So green growth is ultimately fundamentally about getting your industrial policy right. Given if there's one area where in fact markets need help from collective action in order to send the right signals to firms, that is of course the area of sustainability, given the huge range of market failures, externalities, learning spillovers, coordination failures, and huge uncertainty and financing requirements that dealing with sustainability requires. But it's important when we think about industrial policy not to think about it in the old-fashioned sense, which was sort of a very top-down kind of industrial policy where the government simply would enunciate a set of standards or requirements or subsidies and incentives and a set of sectors that were going to be privileged, and then would basically just, that was the industrial policy. No. The new kind of industrial policy, which is being put in place in a range of countries now, is one that looks at industrial policy not as a set of incentives and sectoral priorities as a top-down process, but one where in fact it's a process of collaboration, learning, and interaction and cooperation between the public sector and the private sector. So it's a process of interaction rather than any set of particular policies, because it's only through that process of interaction and learning and dialogue that the private sector can inform the government of the various opportunities and challenges that they face in the area. And it's only through that process like that that the government can in turn learn about what kind of changes in regulations, what kind of incentives, what kind of interventions are both harmful and could potentially be useful. So it is this interaction that is the quality of that interaction between the government and the private sector at all levels, not just like this one at the very top level, but throughout society, in different parts of the country, in different states, all the way down to the level of SMEs. It's that the quality of that interaction that seems to me to be critical in getting the industrial policy framework for green growth right. So the answer to the question, do we have a good industrial policy framework for green growth, isn't an answer. The answer isn't going to be, well, we do because look at the number of incentives we have or the number of initiatives we've taken. The answer is really, does business feel that they have this ability to interact in this proactive and productive manner with the government in order to share their problems and their opportunities? And I think that's the direction in which the right kind of green growth can take place. So let me just close my comments this first round by saying, first, I apologize by being the typical member of my profession, this dismal science, economics, and painting a bit of a pessimistic picture for the world economy. On the other hand, I hope I have also said that I do think that Brazil faces much brighter horizon than many other parts of the world today do face. So that's the bad news and the good news. Thank you.